This is now a part two to the video because I reached the maximum limit on my phone. So inshallah, in this part two, we'll spend the next 10 or 15 minutes looking at the rest of this hadith, or these two hadith. As I was saying in the previous recording, the Prophet ﷺ spoke about different people who would observe ritual worship and were very avid in offering prayers, but they had bad character. Sayyidah Aisha radiyallahu anha had mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ a woman who would pray during the night but who would harm her neighbors. And she had died, and the Prophet ﷺ said that she's in hellfire. Because religiosity is not reduced to simply praying 5 times a day, fasting in Ramadan, and the outward rituals of Islam. Those rituals have to transform our character. This separation of deen from character is an absolute catastrophe in the minds of many people who feel that as long as they go to the masjid and offer their 5 prayers, as long as they fast in Ramadan, as long as they give zakat, they can cheat people, they can be rude to people, they can be arrogant and high-handed over people, they can defraud people in the marketplace. How many times do we hear of people complaining about individuals who have large beards and kufis and they're praying 5 times a day in the masjid, yet when it comes to basic business dealings, they cheat others. They defraud others. They lie to other people. They act rudely and arrogant to other people, and they think they're religious because they have the outward trappings of religiosity. They have the outward appearance of the religious person, but they don't have the character. So you have in this conversation, you have 2 extremes. You will have the extreme of those who give value to the outward trappings of religiosity and the ritual worship and neglect the character. This is the person I was just describing with the big beard who's praying all the time, but who cheats people in the market. But you also have another extreme, and that is the extreme of the person who says, I may not pray, I may not do this or that, I may engage in this and that haram, but I'm a good person. I'm nice to people. Therefore, I'm actually a good Muslim. They give more importance to being nice to people than establishing the fard, than establishing their 5 prayers, than fulfilling the basic pillars of Islam and abstaining from the haram. This is also an extreme. This is the extreme that considers it enough to be a nice person. So in their mind, they can neglect the rights of Allah Ta'ala as long as they're a nice person. And in the minds of the other person, as long as they're praying their prayers and giving Allah His rights, it doesn't really matter too much if they're mean or if they're a cheat. Both of these are extreme understandings. Both of these are false understandings of what character is. The Prophet ﷺ says, Al-birru husnul khuluq. Bir, righteousness, is good character. And that is how we interact with others. But bir is also in the ritual worship as well. So, moving along, we have in the first part of the hadith of al-Nawas bin Sam'an, where he says that he says that righteousness is good character. And then he says that sin, ithm, is what haka fi nafsik, is what scratches at your soul. And that is the feeling that arises in the soul where one is uneasy. Now, ithm in Islam is defined as sin, or translated as sin. And it's defined as any action that deserves blame and rebuke. That has been condemned in the sacred law, in the Sharia, in the Quran, or in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And sin encompasses both major and minor sins. Here in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ gave us 2 signs for sin. He said that sin is what scratches at your soul, and he says it is what you would dislike others to see you doing. But we have to be careful here. When the Prophet ﷺ says sin is what scratches at your soul and what you would dislike for other people to see you doing, we have to ask ourselves, who are these people? Are they just anybody? They're not. According to some of the commentators on the 40 Hadith, the people here are the respected people of deen, Ahlud Diyana, meaning sin is defined here as what scratches at the soul and what you would not want decent and good religious people to see, people for whom you have high regard. And this is because if you take an example, take a sin like drinking alcohol. If a drinker is in a bar, he's not going to be too bothered by other drinkers seeing him in the bar. If he's in a bar with other drinkers, he's not going to be bothered that those other drinkers see him drinking. But if he was out in public and people of outward religiosity, people of dignity and respect, whom he holds in high regard, saw him drinking, he would feel ashamed. And he would not want them to see him drinking. So the Prophet ﷺ is guiding us here that sin is that thing which scratches at the soul. The person of Iman is going to feel uneasy about, and they would not want people of deen to see them do it. And Imam Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, he notes in his commentary that the deeds here that we wouldn't want others to see refer to actions from a dini standpoint. And that's because, of course, there's actions, things that we do day to day that we wouldn't want anyone to see, that are part of our natural functions and our hygienic routines of going to the bathroom, of showering, these personal habits. We wouldn't want people to see them. That doesn't make them sinful. So the things that we wouldn't want others to see are those things that are tied into deen as matters of halal and haram. So if you feel that scratching at your soul, this unease, you don't feel right about it, that's actually the sign of your heart being alive, and it's a sign that that thing's a sin. And if it's something you wouldn't want other people to see you doing, people you respect for their piety, then that's an indication that what you're doing is a sin. And it's a sign that you should pay attention to and therefore leave that action. In the second hadith, the one of Wabisa, the companion Wabisa says that he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ says, "Ji'ta tas'alu 'anil bir." He preempted Wabisa's question by saying, "You've come to ask about righteousness." And this is because Allah Ta'ala disclosed to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ what Wabisa came to ask about. This is the knowledge, the superlative knowledge given to the Prophet ﷺ by Allah. Allah allowed him to, or disclosed to him the reality of Wabisa and what he was going to ask about. And he gave a similar definition and said that you should seek fatwa from your heart. That meaning you should consult your heart. Now, this is a very sensitive issue, because here the Prophet ﷺ is saying that when it comes to matters of piety and matters of sin and determining what is sinful, one should seek fatwa from their heart, or one should consult their heart. The question here is, how do we know that we are consulting our heart and not consulting our ego? If something comes up in our life and we consult, we look inward to see how we feel about it, how do we know that as we look inward, we are consulting our hearts and not our ego. How do we know that the answer provided is coming from our heart and not coming from our ego? This is a very important question, because if we don't know the answer to that question, it is very easy to take this hadith and attempt to apply it in our life and realize that we are seeking consultation from our ego and not from our heart. And there's a couple of different ways this has been addressed in our tradition. Some of the ulama who commented on this hadith have said that this guidance to consult the heart is particular to Nawas, in particular to Wabisa, because the Prophet ﷺ knew their state, knew their piety, and recognized that if they consult their hearts, they will discover whether or not that thing is sinful, because they have enough sensitivity and purity in their hearts to know when consulting it that this is something they should do or it's something they should not do. So some scholars restrict this hadith and say that it applies to these two companions who asked. Others say that it doesn't apply exclusively to them, it applies to anyone else, provided the person seeking the answer in consulting their heart has purified their heart and they have enough sensitivity to know the difference between ego and heart. And it's not an easy question to answer. Am I consulting my heart or am I consulting my ego? It means that in order to even ask that question, there has to be certain groundwork that has been laid, certain foundations that have been laid in refining the heart and developing that sensitivity. So one has to be very careful lest they take this hadith and consult their ego and think they're consulting their heart. The basic guidance of the hadith, of both the hadith of Nawas and Wabisa, is that you have to go with the sensitive feelings of your heart if you have sensitivity, and not just listen to what other people are telling you. Imam al-Nawawi, in his own commentary on this hadith, he gives a really good example. He says that if someone receives a gift from a wealthy person and they know that wealthy person earns some of their money from unlawful sources and some from lawful sources, he may go to a mufti and say, Mufti, ya Shaykh, please give me a fatwa. This wealthy person gave me a gift, yet his wealth is mixed with halal and haram. Is it allowed for me to take this gift? Imam al-Nawawi says that if that person seeks a fatwa and the mufti gives the ruling that he can take the gift, if that person still feels uneasy after the fatwa, he should listen to his heart and disregard the fatwa of the mufti allowing the action. Because if he disregards the fatwa of the mufti and gives up that wealth, there's no harm. He's not actually doing anything. This is a good example of seeking counsel from one's heart when there's sensitivity. To go with the feeling of the heart if they're feeling in doubt, but that has to be based on the heart being sensitive, and it should also be based on some degree of actual knowledge of Sharia, because a person can easily say, I hear the fatwa of the mufti, but I don't feel easy about that thing, so I'm going to leave it, even though what they're leaving is proper. An example of this would be a person who they fast when they're traveling, and they undergo great difficulty in their fast when traveling. And they're told, you can break your fast when traveling. It is not required to fast in Ramadan in those days when you are on a journey. And that person says, no, I don't feel right about that, so I'm going to keep fasting and undergo hardship. They are undergoing hardship even though that is the basic principle in Sharia. As the Prophet ﷺ says, "Laysa minan birri as-sawm fi safar," that it is not from piety to fast while one is traveling. Meaning, to endure hardship in fasting while you're traveling is not piety. We have a rukhsa, a dispensation from the Prophet ﷺ to break the fast when we're traveling. So caution in that area is unwarranted. So even if the person's heart feels uneasy about it, we have the clear license, the clear dispensation from the Prophet ﷺ to break the fast or to not fast when we're on a journey. So this last part is very sensitive, and we have to be very careful that we distinguish between the heart and the ego, and that we have some baseline of Sharia knowledge before we even consult our heart and just go with what we feel. Because we may receive a completely legitimate fatwa that is not a product of a person's own ijtihad, but rather from a direct nas, a direct text of the Prophet ﷺ. And what we're feeling uneasy with is based on our ignorance and not based on sound knowledge or sound piety. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us all of these meanings and realities, to grant us good character, and to grant us that tamyiz, that discernment, where we understand the difference between the ego and the heart, and to give us that enhanced sensitivity to understand those feelings as they arise. As Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, إِن تَتَّقُوا اللَّهَ يَجْعَلْ لَكُمْ فُرْقَانًا. If you have taqwa of Allah, He will grant you a criteria, a furqan, a means of distinguishing between truth and falsehood, a means of distinguishing between right and wrong, halal and haram, proper and improper, good, better, and best. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.